I was never one for vintage things. The idea of collecting old items, especially ones with a history, always creeped me out. But when I got home from work that Friday afternoon, I found a plain, unmarked package on my doorstep. It wasn't unusual to receive random deliveries since I often ordered things online, but this package was different. It was small, maybe about the size of a shoebox, but much heavier than expected. I picked it up and immediately felt a strange sensation in my chest, like the box itself had a pulse. Brushing off the feeling as exhaustion from a long work week, I carried it inside, setting it down on my kitchen table. There was no return address, no indication of where it came from. My name was scribbled on the front in jagged, almost childlike handwriting. A sense of unease washed over me, but curiosity got the better of me as it often did. I grabbed a knife and carefully cut through the tape, peeling back the cardboard flaps to reveal the contents. Inside, wrapped in layers of old newspaper, was a doll. A porcelain one, to be exact. She had bright blue glass eyes, unnervingly perfect skin, and reddish-brown curls that looked eerily realistic. The doll was dressed in what appeared to be a 19th-century gown, a pale blue dress with lace trimming, as though she had been plucked straight from the past. But what made my skin crawl was how those glass eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, as if the doll was watching me, studying me. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I regretted ever opening the package. I pulled the doll out, setting her down on the table. My fingertips felt cold from the contact with the porcelain. I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling exposed, though I was alone. The apartment had never felt this empty before. Who the heck would send me this? I muttered, thinking aloud as I inspected the doll. There was no note, no message, no explanation for why it had arrived at my door. The whole situation felt wrong, like I was about to stumble into something I wasn't meant to. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. I placed it on the living room shelf, far enough away so it wouldn't be within eyesight when I tried to sleep. But the memory of those glassy eyes lingered in my mind. The silence of my apartment seemed heavier, more oppressive, as if I wasn't alone. I had just drifted off when I was startled awake by a soft creaking sound. I shot up in bed, heart racing, straining my ears to figure out where the sound had come from. It was faint, but it was there. A shuffling, scraping noise like something moving across the floor. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe the wind outside or the apartment settling. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was coming from the living room. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tiptoed toward the living room door. The air felt thick, stifling, and my breath caught in my throat as I peeked around the corner. My heart dropped into my stomach. The doll wasn't on the shelf where I had left it. Instead, it was sitting on the coffee table, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, those cold glass eyes staring right at me. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the doorway, my eyes locked on the doll. I couldn't have moved it. I'd left it on the shelf, far from the coffee table. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the rising panic. Maybe I was just tired, my brain playing tricks on me. I took a step forward, cautiously approaching the doll. But with every inch I closed between us, the unease gnawed at me deeper. What the heck is going on? I whispered, though I knew no one could answer. The doll sat there, motionless, its head cocked unnervingly to one side. I could feel those eyes on me, unblinking and empty. It was absurd, I knew that. Dolls couldn't move. There had to be an explanation. I reached out, almost afraid to touch it, but I forced myself to pick it up. It was heavier than I remembered, its porcelain limbs cool to the touch, and I could swear the chill from it seeped into my skin, crawling up my arm. I quickly placed it back on the shelf, my hands trembling. I stood back, watching it, waiting for anything to happen. But the doll remained still, propped against the wall like a silent guardian of my growing fear. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. It was just a creepy old doll. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The room felt too quiet, too still, as if even the air had thickened with the weight of something unseen. My heart was pounding as I double-checked the locks on the windows and the front door. Everything was secure, but that did little to ease my anxiety. Back in bed, I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my mind racing with thoughts of the doll and how it had moved. Sleep finally came, though fitful and filled with strange dreams. I woke in the dead of night to a sound that made my heart skip a beat, a soft, hollow tapping, like tiny fingers drumming on glass. My eyes shot open, and I held my breath, listening. There it was again, coming from the direction of the living room. My stomach churned as I lay there, frozen, every muscle tense. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to know what could be causing that sound. But I couldn't just lie there, paralyzed with fear. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something was waiting for me to come and find it. I moved closer to the living room, the shadows playing tricks on my mind as I passed through the dimly lit hallway. My hands trembled as I flicked on the light switch, casting a pale glow over the room. The doll was on the coffee table again. I stared, my heart in my throat. I hadn't moved it. I was sure of that. But now it sat there, legs dangling over the edge, its hands resting in its lap, and its head was straightened, staring directly at the front door. And that's when I noticed the window. The tapping hadn't come from inside. It was coming from the window behind the doll. I took a shaky step toward it, my legs feeling like lead. There was nothing outside, just the dark, empty street, silent and still. But as I leaned closer to the glass, I saw it. Written in a foggy smear on the outside of the window were two words: I see. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with terror. My eyes darted to the doll, then to the door, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. Someone had to be playing a sick joke. But who? And how? I grabbed the doll, throwing it into the corner of the room, as if that could somehow break the spell it held over my home. The porcelain hit the floor with a dull thud, but it didn't shatter like I expected. It just lay there, its face turned toward the wall, its glass eyes hidden from view. I rushed to the window, locking it and pulling the curtains closed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. The room felt claustrophobic, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet I wasn't sure I had actually heard anything at all. But it came again, just loud enough to send a chill down my spine. Jenni! I spun around, eyes wide, searching the room. There was no one there, no source for the sound. But I knew what I'd heard. It had whispered my name. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the apartment felt amplified, unnatural. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching my phone, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks in the curtains, I finally dared to breathe again. But the doll! I couldn't face it. Not yet. Something had changed in my apartment, something dark and malignant, and I knew the doll was at the heart of it. The next morning, the apartment was still. Too still. I'd been awake for hours, and though the sun was up, the place felt shrouded in an eerie calm. My mind replayed the events of the night over and over again. The doll, the tapping, the words on the window, and that whisper. My name. I stared at the clock on the wall, realizing I hadn't moved from my corner in hours. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. I needed to get out. I had to clear my head. Grabbing my keys, I practically bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. The fresh air hit my face like a wake-up call, but the feeling of being watched followed me. I walked down the street, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was trailing my every step. My eyes darted around, scanning the faces of passers-by, but no one paid me any attention. After about half an hour of aimless wandering, I stopped at a small coffee shop, hoping a hot drink would calm my nerves. As I sat by the window, staring out at the busy street, I thought about the doll. I could leave it outside, throw it in the trash, or take it to the nearest pawn shop. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. It felt like the doll had attached itself to me, like it had become a part of my life whether I wanted it or not. I took a sip of coffee, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe someone was messing with me, playing some elaborate prank. But the voice, the words on the window, those weren't things you could easily explain away. I decided that when I got home, I would get rid of the doll. No more second thoughts. When I returned to the apartment, everything was exactly as I had left it. The living room was quiet, the curtains drawn, and the doll was still lying in the corner, its face turned toward the wall. I hesitated for a moment, standing in the doorway, wondering if I should even touch it. But I had no choice. It had to go. I grabbed a box from the closet and walked over to the doll, holding my breath. Slowly, I bent down and reached for it, but as my fingers brushed its porcelain skin, a strange sensation shot up my arm, like an electric current. I yanked my hand back, staring at the doll in disbelief. Its head had turned ever so slightly, just enough to face me. I gasped, stumbling backward. My heart raced as I backed away, nearly tripping over the coffee table. I couldn't take my eyes off the doll. Those unblinking, glassy eyes seemed to drill into my soul. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could just throw away or ignore. Then I heard it again. The whisper. Jenni. This time it was clearer, more distinct, and unmistakably close. My blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. There was no one there. But the voice, it had been real as the tapping on the window last night. I looked around frantically, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then the lights flickered. The room dimmed for a brief second before plunging into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. I was left standing there in pitch blackness, my pulse pounding in my ears. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. The beam of light wavered as my hands shook, but I caught sight of the doll in the corner. It was no longer sitting against the wall. It was standing on its tiny porcelain legs, its head tilted up at me. I screamed, stumbling backward, nearly dropping the phone. The doll didn't move, at least not that I could see. But it stood there, silently watching me with those cold, dead eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I bolted for the front door, flinging it open and running down the hallway. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to get as far away from that apartment as possible. But even as I rushed outside, into the safety of the daylight, I knew deep down that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the apartment. I could feel it, a presence, something dark, something that followed me, even out here in the open. I looked around wildly, but there was nothing, no one. I hurried to a nearby park, sitting on a bench trying to catch my breath. I tried calling a friend, but every time I dialed, the call wouldn't go through. My phone was acting up, first the power, now this. I stared at the screen, the reflection of my wide, frightened eyes staring back at me. That's when I noticed it. In the reflection, just behind me, there was movement. Slowly, I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing in the shadows of a tree, was a figure. A child-sized figure, wearing a pale blue dress with lace trimmings. The doll. It was here, outside. It had followed me. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing, but in the moment it took for my eyes to refocus, the figure was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. I stood up, looking around in a panic. There was no one, just the wind rustling through the leaves. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining this. The doll was real, and it wasn't just a creepy relic from the past. It was alive in some dark, twisted way, and it wanted something from me. I just didn't know what. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I wandered around aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. But no matter where I went or how far I tried to run, I could feel the presence of the doll lingering. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see those cold, lifeless eyes staring back at me. I couldn't go back to my apartment. Not yet. The idea of walking back into that space made my skin crawl. But what choice did I have? I couldn't stay out here forever. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the shadows stretched long across the streets, and I knew I had to make a decision. I pulled out my phone again, desperate for some contact with the outside world, but the signal was still acting up. The apps wouldn't load, the calls wouldn't connect, and even my messages wouldn't send. I was completely cut off. Alone. With a deep breath, I decided to return to my apartment. I had no other option. I couldn't let a doll, an object, rule my life like this. I told myself I would grab a few things and stay at a friend's place for the night, or even check into a hotel. Anything to avoid spending another night in that cursed place. When I finally reached my apartment, the sun had fully set, and the hallway leading to my door was eerily silent. Every footstep echoed in the stillness, and my heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with my keys. I opened the door, half expecting to find the doll waiting for me, but the living room was empty. The doll was still where I had last seen it, lying crumpled in the corner, face hidden from view. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences and my mind playing tricks on me. But then, as I crossed the threshold into the living room, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a barely noticeable drop in temperature. But as I moved deeper into the apartment, the chill became more pronounced, and with it came a sense of foreboding, like the very walls were closing in on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I froze, every instinct screaming that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it again, the soft creaking like tiny porcelain limbs shifting ever so slightly. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my head slowly toward the corner of the room. The doll had moved. It was no longer lying on the floor. It was sitting up, propped against the wall, its head turned toward me, eyes glinting in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my body trembling with fear. This was real. This was happening. Before I could react, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for the briefest moment before returning. My pulse quickened and I spun around, desperate for some way out. But something was blocking the door. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shadow dark humanoid, standing between me and the exit. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as I scrambled away from the figure. My body moved on autopilot, driven by pure fear. I didn't look at the doll again, I couldn't. But I could feel it. It was moving. I didn't have to see it to know. The shadow in the doorway seemed to grow, looming over me as I backed into the far corner of the room. I was trapped. I clutched my phone in my hand, fingers shaking as I pressed the screen, hoping to call for help. But nothing happened. The screen was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, sending a wave of nausea through me. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, ancient, and malevolent. "Jenni!" I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Jenni, you can't run." The room grew colder, and I felt a pressure around my chest, like invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. I gasped for air, my vision blurring as panic set in. The doll, the shadow, whatever it was, it wanted me, wanted something from me. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I pushed myself up and darted toward the door, shoving past the shadowy figure. My hand fumbled with the lock as I threw the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, panting and drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I leaned against the side of the building, staring up at the dark windows of my apartment. I couldn't go back in there. Not ever. But as I stood there, trying to calm my racing mind, I felt something cold against my hand. I looked down, my stomach twisting into knots. It was the doll. I hadn't taken it with me. I had left it behind in the apartment. But there it was, cradled in my arms as though it had followed me out. I dropped it, stumbling backward in horror. The doll landed face down on the sidewalk, but as it hit the ground, its tiny porcelain hands twitched. And then, very slowly, it turned its head toward me, glassy eyes reflecting the streetlight. It was never going to let me go. The streetlight flickered above me, casting long, sinister shadows on the pavement. My entire body felt numb, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared down at the doll. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, the glassy eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground, frozen in terror. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if the very night itself had come alive. The doll lay motionless, but I knew with every ounce of my soul, that it was far from lifeless. Something dark, something ancient had taken hold of it. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes never leaving the porcelain figure. I didn't know where to go, who to turn to. I was alone in this nightmare, trapped in some twisted game that I didn't understand. My mind raced, searching for any explanation, any way to escape this madness. Then, as if sensing my desperation, the doll moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the fingers, a slight shift in its position. But it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned on my heel and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me down the empty street. The cold night air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the other side of town, collapsing onto a park bench, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I thought I was safe, that I had finally outrun whatever force was haunting me. But then I felt it again, that cold, oppressive presence. Slowly, I lifted my head, and there it was, sitting on the bench beside me. The doll. My throat tightened, and I scrambled off the bench, my back pressed against a nearby tree. It wasn't possible. I had left it behind, run miles away. And yet, it had followed me. It was always one step ahead, always waiting. The doll's glassy eyes stared up at me, as lifeless as ever, but I knew there was something behind those eyes. Something malevolent, something that wanted me. I felt its pull, its twisted energy wrapping around me like invisible chains. Tears blurred my vision as I sank to the ground, my back sliding down the rough bark of the tree. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't fight it. Whatever this thing was, it was stronger than me. I was powerless against it. And then the whispers started again. "Jenni!" The voice was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing all around me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to drown out the sound. "Jenni, you were chosen." I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. "Chosen for what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment, the whispers stopped, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. And then, as if in response to my question, the doll stood up. I watched in horror as it moved, its porcelain limbs stiff and unnatural, but undeniably alive. It took a step toward me, its tiny feet tapping on the concrete path. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed myself further against the tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, as it stood before me, the final revelation came. The doll wasn't just possessed. It wasn't just some cursed object. It was a vessel for something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment. "You can't escape, Jenni," the voice whispered, louder now, filling the night air. "You belong to me." I shook my head, sobbing, but deep down I knew it was true. From the moment I had opened that package, I had sealed my fate. The doll had chosen me. It had been waiting for me, drawn to me for reasons I couldn't understand. And now it was claiming what it believed was rightfully its own. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the soulless eyes of the doll, as the world around me seemed to fade into the background. Time lost all meaning. The whispers continued, filling my mind, my body, my very soul with dread. But then something changed. The doll's glassy eyes flickered, just for a moment, and the voice faltered. For the first time, it seemed uncertain. I blinked through my tears, my chest heaving as I forced myself to stand. The presence was still there, heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't as strong as before. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely powerless. With trembling hands, I reached for the doll, wrapping my fingers around its cold porcelain body. I could feel the energy pulsing through it, dark and unnatural, but I didn't let go. "Not this time. You don't control me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The doll was motionless in my hands, and the air around me felt lighter, less oppressive. I didn't know if I had won, or if I had simply delayed the inevitable. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. I stood there in the middle of the park, clutching the doll, unsure of what to do next. But one thing was certain: I couldn't run from it anymore. I had to face it, whatever it was, head-on. I turned and walked back to my apartment, the doll still in my hands. The streets were empty, the night unnaturally quiet. I didn't know what would happen when I got back, or if I would ever truly be free of this curse. But I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to confront the darkness. As I reached my front door, I glanced down at the doll one last time. Its eyes were closed now, its body limp and lifeless. Whatever power it had once held over me seemed to have faded, for the moment at least. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The doll had claimed me, and no matter what I did, it would always be a part of me. Waiting, watching, and someday it would return. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Even when you were alone?